And we're live. Hey, everyone out there. Thank you so much for coming to this live episode of the Swift Kick Show. Sorry it took us a couple minutes to hit the go button, but you know how technology is. It never works right the first time. You gotta just keep kicking it until it starts working. In our case, we had to
live is hard.
They had to spin up more Docker containers just to deal with all the people that are currently watching us. So, you know, that's how these things work. All right. Let's see. I'm making sure everything's going live for everyone. All right. So we're live everywhere. We're supposed to be live. We have a good number of people in the chat today. So there's already been some chatter. But if you're out there, first, tell me, where are you from? So I'm from Chesapeake, Virginia, not that far away from where Bret lives. But currently I'm in Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina, at this fantastic co-working space called the Frontier, where they're giving me free space to sit here and talk with you all. So great location. Bret's hanging out in Southeast Virginia, a couple miles from, about like a mile and a half from the beach.
Something like that.
Yeah. So Jamie's in Raleigh. So if you're in Raleigh, you should come see me tonight. I am speaking at the Trinug, the Triangle.net users group. Even if you don't do .net, come down, say hi. I would love to meet the crowd. Just search
it's a cool place.
Trinug if you want more information. I love coming to Raleigh. It is a great location. All right, we have some folks in Northern Virginia, India, Germany. Wow. So I'm assuming most of you are here because Bret said something, probably in his Docker Mastery course. So if you also don't mind, put in chat how'd you find out about this show? And if you all just say Bret, it doesn't matter.
So, Bret told me.
Everyone, yeah.
Basically, the internet. The internet told us to be here, and cool.
We listen to the internet whenever the internet says something.
So we're going to spend some time talking about Docker, obviously.
Yeah.
Because that's all we talk about. All I talk about. And I think we're going to focus on compose and local development. So there's lots that goes into that, right?
Yeah.
Kevin's a developer. He's C#. He's .NET. He's also Node.js. Done all sorts of languages, front-end stuff. Kevin, how long have you been using Docker?
I started playing with Docker a little bit when you started playing with Docker, but I did not go head first like you did. I just kind of stood on the shore and went, that looks nice, and went off and did other things.
You let me deal with the pain.
Yeah.
Pain and suffering. And that was early days of Docker.
Someone has to be the captain and steer the ship forward. I'm in like a dinghy behind the ship. I'm just following everyone wherever they go.
Nice. The dinghy. They're in the Docker dinghy. Well, hopefully we can clear up some common use case problems, local development, and I think before we get started, I just wanted to before we get the command line, I thought maybe we could do some slides, right? Just a couple of basic slides. This is not a slide presentation, but I have a lot of slides and I like to show them. So let's
go for it
and see what happens.
All right, I'm going to shut off my camera and my mic. But if people have questions, just put them in the chat, and I'll stop Bret as necessary.
Yeah. So right, Kevin's going to check on the chat while I'm talking away. So I noticed that because of YouTube Live and stuff, we're a little bit delayed. So if you see, if you type in a question or you have a comment, then it might take us a minute or two before we see that. So Compose is a tool that comes with the Docker kit that you get whether you're on Windows, Mac, Linux. Docker Compose is a separate command line from Docker. If you're familiar with the Docker command line, a lot of that transitions you to Docker Compose. But I still see, even though Compose is a tool that's almost as old as Docker, that people aren't necessarily using it every day in their Docker workflow. So I thought I would give you a little bit of intro just in case you're kind of sort of new to it. If you're using Docker on a project and you probably get pretty quick into it and you're realizing that your commands kind of get a little hairy when you're starting things up. Especially if you're using development, you tend to have to do things like volumes, and you have to maybe put in some environment variables. And so if you have a database, then things get really crazy, right? So just forget about it. The insanity of trying to type all the same things you need over and over in Docker command line is not a great user experience. Now, Docker, the command line is way better than containers were before Docker, like a decade ago. But for day-to-day use, it doesn't lend itself well to easy automation developer stuff, right? Now, we do have GUIs. We've all got GUIs now, editor GUIs, Visual Studio Code, the PHP, Storm, and all the other developer environments and IDEs are getting better at allowing us to automate Docker and Docker Compose. But I feel like they've got a long way to go, so I still spend a lot of my time at the command line doing Docker commands. But you don't want to really be doing these Docker run commands. And so what people sometimes, if they don't know about Compose and don't realize how awesome it is, they start making shell scripts. So I'll throw some tips at the end, but basically one of those tips is don't do that. Throw away your shell scripts if you're using them to simply spin up containers for local testing and development and spinning them back down. That's not an ideal situation, because that usually, if you want to change anything, you're going to have to go into the shell script and edit it and then close it. If you want to possibly see the status of things, you don't get any benefit out of your shell scripts. So what we really want to get to is this sort of scenario where your daily workflow is: I sit down on my computer, I do a Docker, get in my directory wherever my app is at, and I Docker Compose up, and then I work, and I'm going to do some Docker Compose commands like Docker Compose PS or Docker Compose stop during lunchtime when I want to stop some containers. But at the end of my workday, I do a Docker Compose down. That gets rid of my containers and my VM. It actually keeps my data around if I have volumes. Obviously, anything on your local host machine will stay there. It's not going to delete anything there, like your code repos. But when I'm working with a team and they're new to Docker, one of my first objectives is to take that long documentation they might have on getting from a brand new developer on a blank machine and getting them to their first commit, right? And usually we talk about that time to first commit as a critical part of a new developer. If you're on here, you're probably not a new developer. You're probably not new to a team, but the ability for a new developer to get started on a project, I think, is directly related to our daily workflow of just using a project, right? We all get new machines at times. Sometimes we have to format our machines because they're completely broken. Sometimes we want to change our environment or run stuff in a VM. Maybe we're a Windows or Mac person and we want to run a Linux VM and to learn that, so we want to do some development in there. Anyway, we've got lots of occasions where you need to reset up your environments. And if they're a 10-page document, which I have seen, 10, 15-page developer setup documents, you don't want that. And so my goal is always to get everyone into Compose. At the end of the day, that challenge is, how do I make the things you're doing now in your workflow be compose? I don't know if there's a verb there. Composable. Put them in Compose file. Put them in Docker Compose commands. So we can just jump into the command line real quick, and we can look at some stuff. So there's lots of examples. I'm just going to use Node.js today because that's a language that I'm kind of sort of good at. Obviously, this works with other languages as well. PHP is a common one I see people using and that I use. Python is also a common one. But obviously, Docker nowadays works with every language and every environment, even including things like Raspberry Pis and mainframes and old 32-bit computers. It just, you name it, Docker probably runs on it. And as long as you can get some sort of developer environment on that machine, I bet you Docker works great. So the Docker Compose command line comes with Docker, right? So we can just look at our version. And I'm on Mac, which means if I got a little Docker for Mac thing running here, as you would on Windows 10 if you're on Windows. Sadly, if you're on older Windows versions or Windows 10 Home or on Linux, you don't get the GUI yet. but you do get all of the tools, the command line. So you're going to have your Docker command line, and you're going to have your Docker Compose command line, right? So I've got, then the versions aren't related. So my Docker Compose is at 121, and it's not necessarily related to my Docker version. But if you're using the Docker for Windows and Docker for Mac desktop editions, those will keep your Docker Compose up to date. If you're on Linux, you're probably going to be using pip, because Docker Compose is a Python app. So you would use the pip install command to get your Compose up to date. If you're on the Docker Toolbox, you will just keep downloading new versions of Docker Toolbox on Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10 Home. Those are the old solution, but it still works great. It uses VirtualBox, works all day long. So if you're in an app, and I'm just going to go through a couple of apps real quick. For example, there's the example voting app. That's from Docker. We can actually go look at that. Where's that repo? Oops. I'm going to increase my stuff here so you can see this a little easier. Yeah, let's look at that app real quick. So this is my fork of, actually, no, this is the Docker samples version. So this is in the Docker samples repo. By the way, Docker samples is run by Docker. If you want to check out, they have lots of Docker samples there. Always good to check out other ways that people are doing things, especially the official ways that people are working on stuff. But the voting app tool, because it's a multi-tier app. So if you're getting started in Compose, you can play around with this app, because it will give you the idea of what services are. And services are basically containers, right? So if you're making containers, you're going to be calling them services in a Compose file. You want at least version 2, typically version 3 at the top there. And it's pretty self-explanatory. It's very terse. In other words, the defaults are all there. You don't have to specify defaults. If you're someone who's used to Kubernetes, typically a Compose file will be 1/3 to 1/5 the size of a Kubernetes services file. So you can keep nice and simple in Docker. So here in this app, I have an existing Docker Compose file. And if I wanted to spin up this multi-tier app locally, I could just do a Docker Compose up. And in the background, that is downloading all of my repos. No, actually, it's not downloading the repos. It's downloading the images, or it's building my local repos if it needs to. It's downloading databases. It's spinning all this stuff up, opening ports, setting environment variables, and it's doing all that with a single command. And that is independent of the app I'm using, which means if you're trying to do open source, and this is my sort of big soapbox moment on, if you want to be open source, you want to get involved with open source, me and my friends and myself have worked on a lot of open source projects, and I can tell you without a doubt, getting new people involved in your project, it greatly improved when you use Docker Compose, especially when you're dealing with people that are maybe new to open source or aren't used to maybe the environments that you're developing in. Because I work with an organization called Code for America, and we use Docker Compose on every one of our projects so that when a new developer shows up, they don't have to learn all the various ways that project needs to be configured for their OS. They just sit down, we help them clone the repos, they get their editor all straight, and then we do Docker Compose up. As long as we get them installed, as long as we get Docker installed, Docker Compose up, everything they need, and builds it for them. And they're away. They're off to the races, right? At that point, they're working on the app, and we basically took what used to be maybe an hour or a multi-hour event of figuring out what Python version they need, or how to get Ruby installed on their Windows machine because they're on Windows and it's a Ruby app. I mean, all those kinds of scenarios, they really go away, all those problems, when you have Docker Compose. So we can see here in the background, this is a multi-tier app, and it's doing things like downloading databases and building stuff. So a lot's going on there. but it's in the foreground. It's kind of in my way. So I could just do a Docker compose up -D. So I hit Control C here to kill the app running, and I want it to run in the background so I can demonize it or detach it, as they say. So I can just do that Docker compose up -D, and it will basically bring all that back up and then allow that stuff to run in the background. And the nice thing is, if you learn some of the Docker command line options, those options will work in Docker Compose as well. So Docker Compose PS is the same as the Docker PS command, only it gives us a different format. It's focused all these commands on my local directory and the project files in it. It actually automatically looks, whenever I type a Docker Compose command, it looks for a file called docker-compose YAML. By default, you can always change that and specify it hard code the command line. But that default is great to use for local developers because they can just download your project, git clone it, and then do a Docker Compose up. Everything should work. So in this case, I don't really know this app, but I can look over here and see that there's a bunch of ports, and I can see that it has a voting app on port 5000. So I can spin up my browser over here and go on my machine to localhost 5000. I get the voting app for cats and dogs. I can vote, and then I can open up localhost. The resulting app over here, it says the result app is on 5858. So I can go to localhost 5858. And it's also, that's the debug port, maybe. I'm not really sure. 5001 is the correct one there. So 5001. Yeah. And so that's the result app. So this is kind of the way you would use it for local development. Typically, you're going to have your apps locally on different ports, even though they may all be on the internet when you're in production on port 80 and 443. Typically, in your compose file, you will direct those to local ports that should be open, usually a hot port. You can even make them random if you want them to be, so that they don't conflict with anything already in use. So,
hey, Bret.
Yes.
We have a question in the chat that might be a good time to talk about now. Is what's the difference between a Docker file and a Docker Compose YAML file?
A Docker Compose file is kind of like the description of multiple Docker files. So a Docker file is around one app you want to run in one container, right? So if I go in, so if you look in this directory, I've got 3 apps at the bottom here. I've got the result, the vote, and the worker app all in this repo. And if I dig into one of them, like the worker app, it's got its own Docker file. So if I just cat out the Docker file, this is describing a single app and happens to be using the .NET Core SDK version, and it's copying in the code, and it's going to spin up that app, right? The compose file is about describing at a higher level the relationships of your different Docker containers, and it also happens to benefit local development workflow. Docker Compose is a difference. There's a difference, I should say, between the Docker Compose file and the Docker Compose command line. The file describes your app and can be used now in 2018. It can be used for local development. It can be used in swarm orchestration and production. And if you're using the Docker command line with Kubernetes, you can use the Docker command line to deploy to a Kubernetes cluster with that same file. You can use it on Docker and Docker Enterprise Edition, the paid version, in the GUI. There's lots of GUI apps that allow you to use production servers with compose files, such as SwarmPit and Portainer and stuff like that. So the compose file, if you look at it, great question. I always focus on selling it to developers as making the workflow easy, but it's a way to describe all of those command line options we had to have put in our Docker commands. So if you looked at this example, all of these options here, this is an example of running a Ghost blog. So if you're familiar with WordPress, Ghost blog is sort of the Node.js competitor maybe to WordPress blog. It's a blog engine written in JavaScript, and it in production, it would use a MySQL server. So if I was trying to use it locally, I might want to replicate that by using a SQL server and then starting up the Ghost. But if I was running these Docker command lines, it would drive me crazy. So then I would end up creating shell scripts, right? But that's not what we want to do. We want to stay away from the shell scripts, especially for local workflow. So not that shell scripts are bad, but they're just a little bit brittle. They're usually host specific. They're hard to share with other people. They're not really clean and clear as a YAML file. So the nice thing is that in this example over here, for that same two commands, right? We have these two commands here. Those same two commands, I can look here. I can describe those options inside this compose file, and then I don't have to type those long commands. I can just type Docker compose up. And the nice thing is that this compose file abstracts away the complexity while at the same time allowing us to connect different containers together in a relationship. So if most of us have multi-tier apps, right? We don't just run one app by itself. It's usually a front end and a back end, or a front end and an API, and then a worker node and a back end. We all have these distributed apps, multi-tier apps nowadays. So you can have one compose file that has dozens and dozens or even hundreds. I've not actually seen any of them with hundreds, but I've seen one, a microservice app that I just recently worked on, was over a dozen in a single compose file. And it's pretty legible, right? YAML is a pretty legible, human-readable language. It actually can be turned into JSON. It's a better human-readable format than JSON. One of my favorite parts is that you can throw comments in, just like right here in this line, and you can't easily do that in JSON. JSON also has a little bit extra syntax around it. Obviously, you got more quotes and stuff like that in there. So in here, the relationships are on YAML. If you're not familiar with YAML, the relationships are based on the hierarchy. So this is a container called, I'm calling it Ghost. Down here is another container called MySQL, and they talk to each other over a Docker network that's automatically created by Docker Compose in the background. So if we go back to this voting app, that one, the voting app, you'll notice in here that I have two network defined. Now, I don't even have to define a network because it will put all of them automatically on a network together. And the way that they talk to each other is really great. It's basically just the DNS name, which is the service name. So if I need one app to talk to another app on this network, I don't put in like localhost bindings and saying, go find my database by localhost port 3368 or whatever. You don't do that in production, so you probably shouldn't be doing that kind of stuff and hard coding those things in development. The nice thing here is this file allows me to say, if I need to talk to the backend database, I can just go down here and find that we're calling it DB. So that's the way I address it on the network. It uses simple DNS resolution. It's built into Docker. Works great. Same for Redis. If I need to talk to the Redis engine, I just tell my app to go to Redis, the host name Redis, and it'll find it. So all of these, the service names, you can see them if I do that same Docker compose PS. You'll see that here the naming is a little wonky, but what it's actually showing you is this is the name of the directory, and this is the name of the app that I need to call it in DNS. And then if I can spin up many of them, multiple copies of the replicas, as we call them. And if I have multiple replicas of them, in case I need 2 or 3 voting apps locally to test, failover, load balancing, that kind of thing, that'll all work here. So there's a lot going on, obviously, in Compose, and you can get really advanced very quickly. You can have complex Compose files, but it doesn't have to be that way to start. So let's jump from this multi-tier one, and notice that I'm still running this one, right? I'm still running this app. It's still working in my browser, but I don't have to kill it. I can leave it there in the background, and I can go to another one. So let's go back over to this Ghost app, right? This is a 2-tier blogging system where I have the app in the front end, the web app running on Node.js, and then I have the database on the back end. So I can also here do the same thing. Docker compose up. And it's going to spin up my database. It's going to create some automation around creating the container. I'm sorry, in the database, creating the tables and whatnot. That's going to be Ghost actually doing that for me. And then Ghost should be available. I'm going to actually Control-C out of that again and do the -D to put it in the background. And you'll notice, by the way, I can get to the logs by just doing Docker compose logs. And that'll spit out my logs. I could even do a Docker compose logs and see all the help commands there and say, oh, look, there's a follow. So I just want to do a -F. So it will keep my logs running as I do things. So now I can jump over here and I can do a local host. I happen to have that running on port 80. And there we go. And you can see that my traffic is coming into my logs and my website's up. And now I can jump on the back end, I could play around with Ghost. I could develop locally using the custom themes and stuff like that on Ghost. And it's running locally. I did not have to go and even look at the compose file because someone else maybe provided that for me. It was inside my repo. Usually you want to put your compose files in one of the repos with your code. Which one you put it in doesn't really matter because you're probably going to have multiple repos for your app. And just pick one of those. Maybe it's the front end, maybe it's the main repo for that app if you have a multi-tiered app with multiple repos. It doesn't really matter. Each repo is going to have its own Dockerfile to make a container of that part of your app. But the compose file sits at a higher level and allows me to do all sorts of things. And if the Docker compose help is great, just like Docker help. So if I just type Docker compose, I get a whole bunch of commands here. And see that there's lots of things you can do. You can run things in the containers in real time. So if I've got this running in the background, right? Maybe I need to jump in my MySQL system and actually do some MySQL commands. So I could do a Docker compose exec MySQL. Let's get a shell there. And now I'm in the actual MySQL container. Oh, and I need to know the password to get in it. So I would use the standard MySQL syntax for getting in to the command line there. This is really great because I don't have to have any of these tools installed on my host system. Now, if you're a GUI person, great. We actually can still use GUI for MySQL in that case because our Docker compose file opens that port. And the way I can see that, if I do the ps command again, you can see actually we are not opening that port up. So let me go in Docker compose. Oops, wrong one. Okay. To the YAML file. So in my MySQL system, I don't have that port forwarded. Maybe I want to go in there and access it. Let's see if the voting app gives us an example of how that looks. Nope, doesn't do that as well over there. So what you just need to do there is I just need to add in the ports. And then just like with Docker, the standard command line format, I would say, is it 3306? I forget. Yeah, 3306. So I changed that file. If I do, and Docker Compose is smart. So if I do a Docker Compose up again, we'll recognize that it changed the Docker Compose file. I'm going to recreate that MySQL container and then open up the port. Now, of course, again, I forgot the -D, so it's running in the foreground. Let me do the up -D again. So in this case, I could, if I wanted to, open up the MySQL Workbench, a GUI free from the MySQL team, and I could develop like I'm normally used to developing with MySQL by accessing the local host. This one is not set up correctly. Yeah, localhost 1 user root. Let's see if it works. No, that's not the one I want. I want 3306. I want the port 3306 user root. And then it's going to ask me for that password, and the password in this case I've actually put that in a secret. If you don't know about secrets, secret's a feature of Docker Compose and Docker Swarm, and it allows you to use secrets that aren't stored in your Compose file if you want to. So that would be my database password. I'd go back over here. There I am. So you can see that I have all my Ghost tables. I don't really know the Ghost tables, so we're not going to dive into that. But that allows me to do typical GUI stuff, just like I would develop locally. If I wanted to do development on the files here, content directory, as you can see, if I go into the Docker Compose file again, those have what we call a bind mount, and they mount my host operating systems directory into that container at runtime, so that when I edit it on the host, it changes it in the app. Now, based on your app, you may have to restart the server. Certain apps like Node.js need you to restart it. You can use something like NodeMon if you're a Node person. Most development environments have that sort of automated restart tooling already accounted for, but that's going to need to run in your Compose container. You're in your Docker container there. But this is a big deal. The ability for us to have our code on the host and then edit it on our host while it's running in that container, that's part of the secret sauce of what makes Compose and Docker for local development great. Because none of us want to have to develop inside of a SSH shell or something like that inside our container. That would be crazy. So when I'm local developing on a machine, I always mount volume of my local code. In fact, I have a third Node.js app over here. As an example, it's a really, really simple app. It's not even a multi-tier app. It's just something, in fact, you can just open this up in Visual Studio Code and just take a look at how simple this Node app is. It's barely, not even 150 lines of code. And this app just so happens to be a testing app that I use when I'm helping people understand Docker and Swarm. It's over here on GitHub at this brown coat URL, Bretfisher/browncoat. Sorry. But anyway, this little simple app has a Dockerfile. It's a kind of a standard Compose, standard Dockerfile for a Node.js app. And then I have for my local development of it a Compose file. And in Compose, there are certain things that we have to care about with Node, right? Node has NodeMon, which is what automatically restarts your app in Node. If you've done Node development for a while, you know that this is a necessary thing for local development. You want this thing to, every time you save a file, to automatically restart. So for my local development, I change the command that the Dockerfile runs so that it always restarts the app for local development. I don't want to use NodeMon in production. That is what Docker is for. Docker is meant to run the app in production and then restart it if it fails. So I don't need NodeMon in production. So in production, I'm going to use my regular Dockerfile. And you can see that, the Dockerfile defaults in my app to just using Node, right, as it should. In production, I'm using the Node. I don't really recommend npm in production. That's a separate conversation that we can get into. But mostly due to complexity, and I just want to guarantee that my app is running exactly what I want it to run. And I also want another layer of abstraction. If you're running in production and you're anything about Node, you started to learn that npm and you're running it, it's actually running Node for you. So you've got this multi-binary situation where really I just want the Node binary to be running in my container, not a nested other binary. Anyway, that's a can of worms that we can open up later. My point here is that the compose file allows me to override that or any other setting that I would set at a Docker run command, right? I can change the port if I need to. This is where I'm doing a little bit of bind mounting, where I'm taking that code, my code that I'm running on my host and editing in my Visual Studio Code. I'm putting that in the volume live on the container. Now, the container already has a copy from the image of my code. But in this case, I'm overriding that at runtime with the code on my host. So anything I change will automatically be live updated because of nodemon restart. So you've got to have that in if you're going to do local development. You're probably going to have to mount that volume to wherever in the container it needs to be. Now, in Node, we have a few weird issues where the Node modules, which is usually a subdirectory of the dependencies in your app, we don't want the ones from the host to get in the container. It's a weird little issue that's common on other environments like PHP and anything where you have dependencies that are in a subdirectory of your app, and the dependencies are binaries, meaning that they're built for a specific OS. Because I'm on a Mac. If I do Node modules on my Mac, and then I put those in the container is actually running on Linux in a tiny little VM. That's not going to work because those binaries are meant and built on my Mac for the Mac OS, not for the Linux OS. So there's been lots of creative ways, I would say, around how to get around that. But the common way, the easiest way, the best way that in my opinion, on how this is dealt with is you, in your app, in the Dockerfile, you move the Node modules essentially somewhere else, so they're not in the same location as your app. So you separate the paths out, and then when you're developing, you do this is like a little protection measure that prevents any host Node modules from accidentally getting put into the container at runtime. And you can find that's a little more complicated than we can get into here, but you can find out a lot about that on my repo. Let me pull that up on github.com/Bret Fisher under the Node Docker Good Default repo. In there's all sorts of documentation about why this is necessary. If you actually go in the compose file, you'll see documentation on each setting I set, why I set that, and where it came from. And a lot of this stuff came from the community, came from people like you, the Node developers that were figuring out ways to solve this problem. So it's nice. As you can see, just on this one file, we've had 6 people actually update it and change it, adding PRs to it. So it's been great to have support from the community on getting sort of a consistent, simple approach to a sort of unopinionated Node app. And that's what's happened there. Any other questions, Kevin? Any other related topics right now?
Let's see. We have a couple. Let's see. One of the questions I don't really understand, so I'm just going to read it verbatim. Can you use Compose to build Dockerfile from a remote repository? This was about 15 minutes ago in your conversation.
No, Docker Compose does not deal with. It doesn't. It can build a Dockerfile by. Okay, maybe I should back up. If they're talking about creating a Dockerfile, no, it doesn't create Dockerfiles. You have to create your own Dockerfiles. If you're talking about building a Dockerfile, meaning doing a Docker build, which is creating a Docker image, it can do that as long as you clone the repo. I don't believe there's any built technology so that it will pull automatically down that repo, because a Dockerfile builds the source code in the current directory, right? So if you're going to build a Docker image in Compose, which you can totally do, right? We're doing that. You can look in this one. We've got some, yeah. So this voting app, build the subdirectory, but you have to have all that source code. So Docker Compose isn't going to do an automatic git clone. It doesn't go to that level of automation. So if you remember from my slides, generally, yes, this is what you want your process to be. You get all the stuff installed, then you git clone your repos, then you go in a repo, presumably the one where you have the Docker Compose file, and you do a Docker Compose up. Hopefully that helps.
And I think a question on a similar note is, if we're using, I think this was just asking for clarification, that if we're using Compose, do we have to use Docker files for building?
I'd say 90% of the time, yes. Okay, so Docker Compose absolutely is using Docker containers. You can't use Compose on something that's not Docker, right? It is the tool that, in fact, when you're running Docker Compose commands, all it's really doing in the background is running the Docker commands for you. It's actually talking to the Docker API of your local Docker instance or wherever you're running Docker. You can actually run Docker Compose against a remote Docker, but it has to be Docker engine, right? The Docker Compose is using Docker API standard in order to communicate. So there is one got you, or one maybe on the answer to that. And that is the on-build commands. So there's this little thing that you can actually do, and Node supports this. It's not well, it's meant for really basic apps in a scenario where you don't have a Compose file, sorry, you don't have a Docker file yet, maybe you don't have a Docker image, but you just kind of want to wing it, because maybe, and the thing about Node is that Node apps are very standard. They all typically come with a package.json file, and that assume an npm install and that sort of thing. So if we jump over to Docker Hub, and we go, actually, we just search for Node. This is a little known feature for when you don't have that Docker file, and maybe you just want to take your project and run it in a container real quick, right? But you still need to run it in a container. You just don't maybe have the Docker file yet. So if you see here, there's these options. These are all the various options and things that are supported on Node and Docker, and you have this on build option. It's not talked about a lot because it's generally only used to get going, and then very quickly you will learn that you want to customize something, and that means you need your own Docker file. But if you just don't have it, the on build, and it actually, they talk about it down here. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah. So even, oh, look at this. Even our thing is depreciated and discouraged now. Well, that's new. But they didn't used to do that, because most of the time people end up using it and finding very quickly that it's not going to support what they need. But what Docker on build does is it allows us to go in here and build a directory and use the on build image, and the on build image will dynamically pull in our source code in the directory, even without the Docker file locally. It's an interesting little sort of almost like a hack on the Docker file. And you can see in here that these on build commands, essentially what that means in a Docker file is that any other Docker container that's going to run from this will execute these commands in the next Docker file. So it's a little hard to understand at first how it works, but I used to actually teach it, but I found with Node specifically, if you remember, we just talked about the Node modules and how those get sort of messed up if you're on an OS that's different than Linux, because binaries don't gel as well. So with Node, I found that we really need a better Docker file, and this doesn't take that into account. It actually will pull everything in. It's not super great for the problem, because right here you can see what it's doing is that it's copying in your package file. It's going to do the install, and then it's going to mount your source code. So if you have any Node module on your host, those will get used in your app and it won't work right. So typically for people, I say on build will save you from making a Docker file, but really, I've got a template. Just use the template. The template is going to work better than the on build command. That's a great question. I'm glad somebody asked it.
Let's see. I'm jumping around in questions here. So I think the next logical question is from Jake. And he said, you have an environment variable that was equal to development. Would you use a different compose file for staging versus production?
Not for that reason. That's the reason that we set environment variables in compose files, because compose files, let me see, there's none in here. Yeah, let's look at the VS Code one. I think that's where we had this. That is a build arg and an environment variable. So we're not going to talk about build args. We'll just talk about the environment variables. Anything you do in compose as an environment variable has multiple ways to be overridden. You can stack up compose files. So you can do a Docker compose command line where you list multiple compose files, and it will layer them over top of each other in an overriding fashion. And this is a standard feature of YAML actually as well, where it will take the second compose file and any changes mixed from the first one, it will overwrite those. So it will allow us potentially to use something called an override file, which is well documented. In fact, I can probably just Google it, Docker compose override. And you'll see that it'll talk here about that by default, compose looks for the Docker compose YAML file, or you can always specify that with the -f if you don't want to use that standard. But it also looks for a Docker compose override file. You can put environment variables that you overwrite there. You can also set environment variables at the command line. So if you're doing local development in Node, typically as a Node developer, you're going to set a local environment variable that's Node in for development. On your production servers, you're not going to be using Docker compose in production. You should use a Docker command line or Docker swarm or Kubernetes in production. I'm a big fan of Docker swarm. It works great with compose files. It works great on a single server. That's for a different day's discussion. But you could just run this same file, and then in your command line, you could do a -e and override that environment variable in line. Or you can even just set it at the shell and just do a export command on a shell, and then you run your compose file after that. So those environment variables are not meant to be overridden necessarily with just another compose file. You also use a .env. And that's the magic of the Docker documentation, is that you will start to learn, and I highly recommend you go read it. And that's why I say in this slide, go read some docs. Before you think you need to do something hard, like create a shell script or create a bunch of automation or something elsewhere, go read a lot of this. There's a ton of documentation about Compose because it has a ton of features. And they're all designed around making your local development workflow easy. That same Compose file can then be used in production with Docker Swarm. So I love to talk about the ease of use from dev to ops of I'm using my local Compose file. It uses my local Docker files. I design my Docker files for production by default. I always have this designed for production. And then I use my Docker Compose file to override any of those changes with my local development environment changes, such as bind mounting my local code, or setting that node environment to development, or changing the command on startup to use nodemon. Those are the things I put in the Compose file for local development. Then in production, I can either have an additional Compose file that overrides with production values, or maybe I'm not using the Compose file at all. Maybe I'm just using a Docker run. Or I might end up using a different Compose file in production. Sometimes you need it, but that's usually my last option. I really don't like having to have duplicate Compose files, one for dev, one for production. But sometimes in complex enough environments, if you're in a large team, it's probably going to be hard to make them work together. But if you're in a large team, everything's complicated, right? So multi-team development, large team development, the repos are all going to be complicated. So, but I highly recommend going and checking out the documentation, spend a couple of hours, and then I have this page up on my browser every day, all day, because everything in the Compose format's in here. If I just go the Compose file reference, it's a huge page of all this documentation for every type. In one single page, basically, is everything I can put in a Compose file. And you'll be amazed at the things you can do in here that you maybe didn't realize you could automate through a single Docker Compose command. So,
You were kind of touching on this subject earlier, but what's the major difference between Docker Compose and Kubernetes?
Okay, so Kubernetes and Swarm are production orchestrators that take many servers and have them act like one. That's essentially all they're doing, right? Docker Compose, the command line, the Docker-Compose command line, is a local development tool to make local development easy. It is not a production tool. You should not be installing the Docker Compose CLI on a server. Docker Swarm is really easy on a single node server, so it's far superior to Docker Compose. People used to use the Docker Compose command line in production. There's no reason to use it now that we have Swarm, and that Swarm is really easy to use, really. The Docker Compose YAML format is something that can work with local Docker Compose command line, Swarm in production, Kubernetes in production. So that format is sort of, it's not an, I wouldn't say it's not an industry standard. It's Docker Inc. standard. It hasn't been formally adopted by Compose, by the Kubernetes team as any sort of official format for them. But if you set up your Docker, if you set up your Kubernetes clusters to work with a Docker command line, you can use the Docker stack deploy command with Swarm or Kubernetes and use that same file. That's not really common yet on the Kubernetes side. People use Helm and other tools. But we're starting to see other concepts. And again, orchestrators are the new Wild Wild West, right? Docker's been around 5 years. The Docker command line is really stable. Docker Compose has been around for 5 years or 4 years. It's been very stable. But orchestrators are where all the action and hot stuff is at. So things are continuing to change in that space. On Kubernetes side, you have Helm, which helps you deploy multi-tier apps, right? On Docker Swarm, we don't really have a Helm, but there's an interesting beta tool that Docker has come out with called Docker App. Let's just go check that out real quick. The Docker App is another command line tool, not officially a part of the Docker toolset yet, but it's meant to allow us to use these compose files in an easier, more abstractable way for development and production, including Swarm and Kubernetes and Helm. So I don't have a whole lot of time today to give you examples at the command line about how it works. It's still very early days. They just launched it at DockerCon a month ago. So it's only in 0.3 release. But they have some great README here on how you can use the Docker app to make a template out of your compose file that abstracts and basically allows you to generate compose files from a YAML template. It's a little weird to describe. It means that I can have compose files that are automatically generated based on values that I throw in at the command line. And then, so you can see, like, it shows you some of the format of what this compose file generator, and it creates a new type of file called the Docker app. This would sit at a yet higher level above the compose files. And so your Docker app file, which is also YAML, would then generate compose files, and compose files use Docker files. So it gets a little complicated, but so it's not going to be necessary for everyone to use it. But one of my favorite features about it is it allows us to use Docker Hub to share our compose files like we use Docker Hub to share our images. And so down at the bottom of this, you can see that there's integration with Helm, as well as sharing your applications on Hub. And really, if you're using Kubernetes, you're probably using Helm to manage your applications and deploy applications, or a Helm competitor. Helm is now kind of the leading way to do that in Kubernetes. But Helm has its own charts, and it doesn't work with Compose. This tool is going to allow you to use your local compose files with Helm in Kubernetes. So I feel like this is the maybe the eventual way that we could all get along and have a single file format that eventually works in all environments or most environments. So we'll see.
Awesome. And we'll take one more question just in respect of time. We've had a lot of really great questions, by the way, so it's really hard to pick and choose. But the last one is actually one I've been interested in, because I know the story has changed, but what's the current recommendation for using Docker with databases? Like I know SQL Server came and blew up that that rationale a year or so ago. But I remember a long time ago, you weren't really supposed to use databases inside of Docker. It wasn't a advised thing to do. Is that still kind of the common recommendation?
There really isn't. Okay, so the caveat here is that you know how to use Docker, right? If you're
Okay.
comfortable, yeah. I mean, and you know how to run databases. So Docker doesn't make a database easier to use necessarily, right? It's a deploy. It helps you deploy and automate updates and keep your environments abstracted away in a nice, secure location. So the short answer is absolutely always use databases in containers if you can. There's a bunch of caveats there. One of them is if you're in the cloud, use the cloud providers' databases. Like I have been running databases for decades. I'm pretty sure that AWS and Azure are better at running databases than I am. So if I've got a multi-tier app I'm running in a cloud, I'm always going to recommend and try to use their database hosting solutions. I maybe won't use their proprietary ones that they created that are only available in their cloud. But if I'm going to do something like MySQL in AWS, then I'm going to use AWS's RDS, which is their hosted Postgres or their hosted Redis, right? Always going to do that rather than run my own. It's going to be way easier and I can get focused on my app instead of the database. That being said, if I don't have that kind of stuff, if I'm in a data center or if I'm in a provider that doesn't have cloud hosting databases, there's no reason why you can't run databases in containers now. For the last 3+ years, we've had Docker volumes, which essentially abstracts away the database data and allows me to easily manage that. I have an example app that even shows how easy it is to just back up your databases. So if you look at this stack file, this is actually in another repo that I have called dog versus cat. If you just go to my GitHub, and you look for something called dog versus cat. Actually, that's not listed there. In dog versus cat, I'm building sort of an example multi-tier, multi-app solution on Swarm, but there's nothing that prevents you from learning from it in other ways. So under the stack ghost file, this is more a production-y way to run the ghost blog. And you'll notice that I have the database here, super easy to use. I even keep the password secure in an encrypted database. The data itself is stored in a volume, so in case I need to replace the container, the database stays around. And I even put that database on remote storage using, in this case, this is using DigitalOcean. So it's using DigitalOcean's block storage, which is shared storage off disk. So if the server dies, my databases are safe. And then I do something really simple here. I just start another container that runs the same database image, and I tell it to run a simple shell command. It runs the MySQL dump as a backup tool, because that's one of the things you can use it for. And it runs it in a shell script that loops every day, or I think in this case every hour. It does a simple little shell loop that creates, it sleeps an hour's worth of seconds, and it creates a file with the date and the hour of that. Actually, it really just creates an hourly based backup, and I think that way it'll loop every day and keep those, and it keeps those in another volume off disk on DigitalOcean's block storage. But I did all this in like 10 lines, right? So not a lot to it, not a lot of hard work there to get a database backup and keep it backed up, and then not a lot of hard work to run the database myself. So absolutely, if you ask someone to run a database, like a clustered database on 2 VMs, they're going to have to spend more work than I would have to do with containers. The thing and the reason that people are nervous about with containers is because it's so easy to, restart Docker or recreate containers. It lends to the idea that you might somehow screw the databases by accidentally deleting them or recreating them. So I would just say, if it's production, be careful. Don't accidentally type just a bunch of random commands in there. I don't feel like it's any less stable. It's definitely way more secure in a database in a container than it is on the host, because now it's locked into this limited environment. If the database somehow gets hacked, it's not going to allow them to get to the other databases just because they're on the same host. It allows me to run multiple databases on a same host without them having access to any other's resources. But obviously, in your production environments, just like everything else, you need to do restrictions on like memory usage, CPU usage, those sorts of things in your containers. I don't really show that here in this example, but you're always going to want to do that if you're trying to run multiple apps on the same VM. Then that's going to be a problem regardless of what you're doing. So there are all those caveats. Those caveats really aren't related to just the database. They're really more about if you're going to run stuff in production, you got to limit the resources. You got to make sure that one doesn't take all the resources and leave nothing left for the others. And that's what SQL is really good at, right? It's really good at taking all the memory on your server because that's what it's supposed to do. So you got to limit the resources. So no, I use them all day. That's a really long answer.
You remember when we used to have like 3-tier Mongo servers and they were all sharding together and just all that effort to maintain databases, and we could have just bought a database and paid like $10 a month for it and done the exact same thing.
Yeah, and that's what I always recommend. I mean, just because we can do these things in Docker doesn't mean that the hosted solution is still the best idea. Yeah, and I mean, I would much rather have like a Swarm or a Kubernetes cluster in production that's running my web front ends and my APIs and my workers and all that, and then leave the databases up to the hosting provider, so that I don't have to worry about those all running on the same server and taking up the same resources and all that sort of stuff. So, but I do run them on servers, and especially for local development, right? Like local development, always running them. I don't want to install anything on my host anymore. I don't want to have to deal with the MySQL version on my host, because now we've got a major new version of some of the database technologies that aren't necessarily compatible with the old ones. So then you have to deal with versions. This is the same problem with Node, PHP, Ruby, all these things. They all have all these different versions. And that's what one of the big things about Docker is it lets us abstract those versions and run whatever version we need for that app in that app. And then when I'm done, I just clean it up, the Docker Compose down, and that cleans up my whole situation, lets me get on with my day without having to worry about what other apps did I break because I changed the version on my system. So
awesome. Well, we are at time, and I know we have so many questions, and we could probably sit here for another couple of hours just answering questions. But Brett's, any final thoughts?
So no, if I would say if you have more questions, throw them. What do you recommend? Can we put them in the YouTube live?
Yeah, we could put them in YouTube live. Actually, anyone who is currently in the Webinar Jam live show, I get all those questions and I can forward those on to you, Bret. Do you want to plug your Docker Mastery course, or Twitter works as well? Whatever is the best way for people to reach out to you. So Brett's phone number is
757. What is it? What are they in movies? 555-5555.
Yeah.
So hit me up on Twitter. Anytime people ask me questions on there, I'm usually responding the same day. I have a ton of resources, including courses at bretfisher.com/Docker. So before we go, I will throw a couple more tips. These are slides that I can put these up on that page, basically on the Docker page, but the command alias is here. If you're someone who uses the ZSH shell with OMyZSH, you can actually get these automatically out of the box. But if you're in my course, you know about that stuff. But these are things that I use all day to shorten up the commands. And so if you know how to do command aliases in your command line, this is like the number one thing I would go do if you're going to use Docker Compose, because it is a lot to type every one of these commands, right? So I make nice little short aliases. Also, always go in and give your Docker more resources if you can. If you have enough machine resources, go into Docker and actually give it more CPUs and memory if you have it. That way, your Docker will run faster, especially if you're dealing with databases and multi-tier app. And then the resources really here would be bretfisher.com/Docker. I'll just show you what that looks like real quick. I have a couple of courses for sale. Each of them are $10 American if you want to use those links. But there's a whole lot of free stuff on here, including YouTube Live. Actually, this video will be those links eventually once it gets on the YouTube as a video on there. And then other stuff like workshop training. I have over 500 slides that you can actually go through on the container training website. Actually, I think the total slide count now, including the Kubernetes, Swarm, and Docker ones, I think it's over 1,500 slides of content. It's insane. I don't make it all. It's actually a team of us that all work on that together, but it's really great. And then articles and stuff like that. There's a public Q&A. If you want to ask me anything, you can do that on GitHub as well as Twitter. And then a whole bunch of sample repos on things you can use to learn Docker, tools you can use to test Docker, stuff like that. So yeah, check that out, bretfisher.com/Docker.
Fantastic. And to everyone who came in through Webinar Jam, we'll also gather some of these resources and email them out to you, so you don't have to remember all this. But bretfisher.com is really easy to remember.
Yeah.
But with that, we'll be back again in 2 weeks with another great instance of the SwiftKick Show. Thank you, Bret, so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure. You are actually the first repeat guest that we've ever had, so congratulations on that record. And
I'm glad to be a part of it.
I can really see that probably in another couple months or a year or so, we'll have you back, because you can't get away from us that easily.
Right. And there's always more Docker to talk about. Absolutely.
And thank you to everyone who attended and everyone who watches this on the replay. We greatly appreciate it. Thanks so much.
All right. Bye-bye.